Cruel and Unusual: A Guide to California's Broken Prisons and the Fight to Fix Them. A decade ago, so many inmates were crammed into California's prisons that the sprawling system had reached a breaking point. Prisoners were sleeping. The California prison population in 2006 in a system designed to house just 85,000. That dubious amount. Since then, California has struggled to deal with a cascading series of problems and almost constant oversight by federal judges. In recent years, here are some takeaways from the epic journey. Arnold's lift. Long before he ran for office, Arnold Schwarzenegger had an interest in prisons and inmate rehabilitation. He felt bodybuilding. It was something of a coincidence, then, that prison reform and inmate rehabilitation became a major preoccupation for Schwarzenegger soon after he was elected governor. Swept into in 2006, of the dysfunctional prison health care system and appointed a receiver to fix the problems. 2 years later, Schwarzenegger, a Republican, tried to walk a line between being tough on violent offenders and simultaneously attempting to reduce the prison population to satisfy federal judges who demanded fixes. When a prison riot broke out in Southern California at the California Institute for Men in Chino, injuring 175 inmates, Schwarzenegger toured the facility and, "Except this is real danger here and real destruction." At the time, in 2009, through the state legislature, the governor attempted to reduce the prison population with home detention and tracking devices for some inmates and shifting some felons to county jails, among other efforts. But he had always a radical injunction from the Supreme Court. In January 2011, California got a new governor, Democrat Jerry Brown. Previously elected as state attorney general, Brown knew the case, Brown v. Plata, well, but 2 years later, on May 23, 2011, his doubts proved wrong. The U.S. Supreme Justice Anthony M. Kennedy was the swing vote, writing a prison that deprives prisoners of basic sustenance, including adequate medical care, is incompatible with the concept of human dignity and has no place in civilized society. In his dissent, Justice Antonin Scalia called the ruling perhaps the most radical injunction issued by a court in our nation's history. He said the court, of those who would be released, he wrote, most of them will not be prisoners with medical conditions or severe mental illness. And many will undoubtedly pulling back on mass incarceration. No other state has made as many radical changes through the ballot box as California. Since government, and soon after the Supreme Court decision, the voters of California were sending clear signals that they wanted to end the era of mass incarceration as well. Through two statewide, with campaign funding from George Soros, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and others, revised the state's Three Strikes initiative to impose a life sentence only when the new felony conviction was considered serious or violent. Significantly, and, approved by voters in 2014, converted many nonviolent offenses, such as shoplifting, writing bad checks and drug possession, from felonies to misdemeanors. The campaign to pass. It's unclear if Jay-Z tipped the balance on the initiative, which passed with 59.6% of the vote. Realignment and local crime. In his first year in office, Brown and the legislature faced a huge task. In response to they reclassified the way the state looked at about 500 crimes to effectively eliminate the possibility of prison time. It applied to anyone. Before and after it was signed by Brown, some lawmakers and local law enforcement predicted the law would lead to an increase in crime at a local level because thousands of inmates would now be housed, and released on probation, in their towns and cities. One scenario so did changing the sentencing laws and realignment really cause a spike in crime? The most their answer no, with the only crime increase attributable to realignment is a modest rise in property crime, driven entirely by auto theft. The researchers breaking the jails. Over the past few years, California has faced what realignment really means. For many local As reporters Jason Cole of the Sacramento Bee and Ryan Gabrielson of ProPublica have shown, the state has. In the 7 years, the state handed the county sheriffs a huge problem and shifted billions of dollars to help them fix it. But some have viewed that the indifference in some jails has come partly because sheriffs hold a unique place in law enforcement. Elected to their own fiefdoms, they cannot be fired except by the voters. California is in Fresno. Sheriff Margaret Mims said there is violence on the outside and violence on the inside. If you wanted fixing the California prisons has been an exhausting fight for decades. The Supreme Court
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park pot.